Right, well, good evening, everybody. I do hope you can all hear me okay, and thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual fisheries forum, which is going to focus on reservoir safety reform. So before I introduce our guests for this evening, just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. So if you don't know me, I'm Alex. I've been involved in organising fisheries forums for the Trust for nearly the last 5 years now. Both in person as our regional forums and online like this tonight. So you should all see, depending on the device that you're logging in from, a Q&A button. If you're on a desktop or laptop, that's usually at the bottom of your screen. If it's a mobile device, it's usually at the top. If you'd like to ask a question at any point tonight, all you need to do is just hit that button, type in what you want to say, and it will then come through to us and we can address those questions for you. Obviously, the presentation portion of tonight is going to be recorded and we're going to circulate that afterwards. So if you've got any colleagues or committee members you'd like to share that with, then you'll be able to do so after the event. And finally, when we do finish, there's just going to be a very short survey that will flash up on your screen as well. So just give you a chance to let us know what you thought about the meeting, what you do differently, and suggest some topics for future. Only other thing to add as well, we'll be producing a written version of that Q&A. So in the very unlikely event we don't get around to answering all your questions before we finish at 8:30, we will of course follow those up in writing. So I think that covers everything. So we will firstly introduce our guest from the Environment Agency this evening, Tony Deakin. Good evening, Tony.
Evening.
And Mark Owen from the Angling Trust. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, everyone.
So before we pull up the slides, Tony, I don't know, do you just want to give a very brief sort of overview of your kind of role and priorities within this?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so my name's Tony Deakin. I'm from the Environment Agency. I lead Reservoir Safety. What that means is that there are 4 teams within the environment, within Reservoir Safety. One is the enforcement team, which predominantly is the regulator. Supporting that enforcement team, we have a compliance and monitoring team, a data and information team, and then we've got a new team now, which we call Standards and Incidents, and I'll just touch on that within the presentation. At the moment, my focus is on future regulations, which is the reason for tonight's talk. And tonight really is to give you an opportunity to hear and see what's happening, and also that opportunity to participate and to feed back into future developments as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tony. And Mark?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm head of fisheries at the Angling Trust. Reservoir safety is something that I've been involved in with Tony for something like 12, 13 years as we've gone through the phases of various changes in legislation. I would add that what we're talking about tonight is changes to risk to assessments of dam walls, raised reservoir dam walls. That's the focus. And proposed changes in the future to how we risk assess and look at the risk of dam walls breaching. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Right, on that note, I will pull up your slides, Tony. So while we're doing this, everybody, if you do have any questions, literally just pop them in the Q&A box and then we'll get around to answering those after the slides. But I'm just going to turn my camera off and pull this up now. And Tony, if you just want to prompt me to move on slides, we will begin.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Right, thanks, Alex. So I just want to say thanks ever so much again for being invited to talk again. I think this is the second time I've been here and to give you a little update. And I just want to give you an update on what we've done since we last spoke. I'm also conscious that possibly there may be a few people on tonight that weren't free to join us on the last time we were here. So I'll just, part of the presentation is just to give you a little recap of where we are and how we want to move this forward. Next slide, please, Alex. So the main reason why we're here today is because I'm sure everyone will have heard of the Toddbrook Reservoir incident. It happened back in August in 2019. One of the big issues there, as you can see, it was a spillway failure. And also one of the big issues was it was a fully compliant reservoir. What I mean by fully compliant was it met all the requirements of the Reservoirs Act, but yet there was the potential that it could have completely failed. Luckily it didn't, with all the response that happened to it, but it could have. After the incident back in 2019, the government decided it needed to carry out 2 reviews. The first review was to look at the incident itself and find out why it happened. And that sometimes is referred to Part A or Barnforth Part A. That report is available on gov.uk, and we can provide you with the links to that report if you wish to see it. From that report, there was a number of recommendations, and what we did to meet those recommendations, we produced 7 new guidance documents. 4 were predominantly guidance documents focused on owners and engineers. The engineers part was to really make sure they fully understood what to do and how to go about inspecting spillways. For the owners, it was really to provide some advice on some of the information that they need to provide to the engineers when they come to carry out their inspections. The other 3 guidances were pure what we call research and development, and that was really looking into mechanisms for spillway failure, maintenance issues regarding how to maintain spillways, and also looking at details of some of the repairs that can be done to maintenance as well. That work's finished, and like I said, there's 7 guidance documents out there. So Part A and all the recommendations that have been implemented. The second part, and that's really why we're here today, is the second part, which again sometimes is referred to as Barnforth Part B, or as we're calling it now, it's really the Reservoir Reform Review. And what that did is, as I mentioned earlier on, Toddbrook Reservoir was a fully compliant reservoir. So one of the questions that we had to ask and had to answer was, is a compliant reservoir a safe reservoir? So part of the review and investigation looked at the current legislation. It looked at the roles of the owners, undertakers, engineers, and the regulator, and looked to see how we could improve that. Within that report, there was 15 recommendations, and again, we'll talk a little bit more detail into those recommendations. Next slide, please, Alex. So like I say, so we're now at a point where we've got these 15 recommendations and we need to implement them. As we said, the work that we're doing now is sort of falls under a reservoir reform. And what I've done with this slide is really just to give you an opportunity to see sort of the vision and the aims. And like we said from the vision, it says we need to produce a safe regime for reservoir dams in England, which protect all our communities by making us ready and resilient to climate change. That's for today, tomorrow, and in the future. I'll not read out all the aims, but again, you can see them. But the main bits we will touch on later on in some of the slides about strengthening the responsibilities for the owners and undertakers and engineers, improving safety practices where we can, modernising the legislation, because as you'll know, the Reservoirs Act was produced back in 1978. So again, a lot's happened since then. Technology's moved on, access to reservoirs have moved on, the need for reservoirs has changed, and the demand as well is going. And then lastly, there's the need to engage with, it says, stakeholders there to help shape the approach and how we deliver. Next slide, please. I'm going to go now into a little bit of detail on some of the work that we will be doing. There's mainly the key reforms. As you can see there are 9 key elements there within this work, and the work we will be carrying out over the next sort of 3 to 4 years. We don't expect a new legislation or an updated legislation to be implemented until at least 2026 to 2027. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is the Reservoirs Act is what we call primary legislation, and that can take a number of years to go through government and parliament and to get royal assent for the changes. So over the next 2-3 years, we will be working hard to deliver these 9 key recommendations and also some other ones, with a view that a new bill or a new act specifically for England at the moment will be introduced. That said, we are working with our clients in Wales and our colleagues in Wales to look at some of the legislation that they want as well. So some of the work that we do, though our aim is for England, it may also be for Wales. But really, Wales, what happens in Wales is the decision and the direction of Welsh Government. So looking at the 9 key bits, the first one really is small raised reservoirs, which I'm sure will be of interest to yourselves. Again, the initial work looking at small raised reservoirs was to look at introducing a voluntary system to register the small raised reservoirs. That work started, and hopefully it'll continue for a few more months. From those voluntary registrations, we'll be able to get a clearer picture on what we think the scope is and the scale is of the small raised reservoirs. We have done some initial work, and the initial work did identify something around about 1,500 reservoirs would possibly fall under the Act if the threshold of 25,000 is reduced to 10. So really, my ask for you tonight is, if you have got any reservoirs where you think fall within the 10,000 and 25,000, then please contact us. If you can provide the information that you've got, it is voluntary at the moment, and then we can register in. It won't mean that you have to follow the Act if you register them with us. It's like I say, it's really about, we're trying to collect as much data as we can that will help us then. We can use that data to help us change the sort of requirements, and we'll be able to use it in some of the work that we've got to do. The second one I was just going to touch on is hazards. As we all know at the moment, in England, there's 2 classifications, high risk and not high risk. Again, that was felt too simplistic, and so we're looking at creating a new hazard classification. That work started. We appointed a consultant called Jeremy Benz Associations, and they're leading some work to look at the hazard classification and to look at how we can change it. Within the Barnforth review, suggested that we should come up with new categories. His suggestion was that the high risk should be subdivided into 3, whether that's called class 1, 2, and 3, high, medium, and low, we're not sure, and that's where this hazard classification work starts. That work's already started. There is what we call a high-level advisory group, and I believe Mark Owen sits on that group to represent yourselves. So if you do need to input into this classification, then Mark would be your conduit into that work. At the moment, the project's looked at an initial sort of 15 options that could possibly be introduced. We've slimmed that 15 down to 6, and now over the next 2 months, those 6 options are going to be worked and a little bit into more detail to see which ones we go forward. And probably around about May time, we should be in a position, hopefully, ideally, with one option may come out, and that may be the preferred option that's taken forward. We may be in positions where 1 or 2 options are still there, and we may need to do some work. But that's the aim, and the objective is to, by May time, we should have a good idea what the preferred option would be on the new classification. There's still lots of work to do after May, because we would need to get that approved through government and through ministers before it finally went. But again, there will be an opportunity for the wider audience to look at those options at a later date and to comment on that as well. Regarding future supplier engineers, I'm sure you're all aware, certainly the members tonight who have got reservoirs that currently fall under the Act or greater than 25,000 cubic metres. There always has been a concern about the engineers. You know, in the nicest possible ways, you know, as dams are aging, our engineers are aging as well. So we've got to think about the future supply with regards to their age. We need to look at recruitment, how we recruit new engineers into this. And also we need to be mindful that, as I said earlier, if the threshold is lowered, then we would be looking at possibly up to another 1,500 reservoirs would need regulating. So again, we may need more engineers to support you and the other owners to make sure that the reservoirs are safe and comply with the Act. Again, that work started. We've appointed the Institute of Civil Engineering to look at that, and they should start on that work shortly within the next month or two, looking at the supply. And that'll look at the number of engineers. It'll look at how we encourage new engineers. It also may look at the current panels of engineers that we have. So again, for people who aren't familiar with the panels, we have an inspecting engineer who comes along once every 10 years to carry out an inspection. And the way I always think about it is in essence, the inspection is a bit like a car MOT. You take your car in for an MOT, it has a check over, it'll either pass and nothing needs doing, or there may be some work that needs doing, or there may be a couple of advisories that say there's a bit of maintenance work that you need to carry on doing before it gets any worse. And that's a similar principle. And an inspection has to be undertaken once every 10 years for high-risk reservoirs. And then there's a supervising engineer panel, and again, the supervising engineer is there to really be the eyes and ears of owners for the reservoir. And they'll go and visit the reservoirs once or twice a year and offer advice and support to the owner with regards to maintenance and general upkeep of the reservoir. There are other roles within the panels, but again, part of the work is to look at, you know, are the panels fit for purpose? Do we need to change them? Can we keep them as they are? Or do we need additional panels or new panels? And again, that work starts shortly, and we would hope by probably about July, August time, where we'll get some findings. That work on the panels does rely on the hazard classification work, because again, if we're coming up with new classifications, we may change the sort of needs and the requirements of the panel engineers to accommodate the different panels. So as an example, at the moment in England, a high-risk reservoir needs a supervising engineer and an inspecting engineer, and not high risk, you don't need either. In Scotland, currently they have a 3-tier classification: high, medium, and low. So in Scotland, a high-risk reservoir needs an inspecting engineer and a supervising engineer. A medium only needs a supervising engineer, and a low doesn't need either. So again, looking at the different numbers of classifications could change the way that we use panel engineers as well. The next one I was just going to pick out again is the new duties, increased duties for ourselves. Again, one of the findings from the review was that our duties are limited in what we can do. So at the moment, we rely quite heavily on the independence of the panel engineers. One of the things that we don't do, or we haven't been able to do, is support the engineers in the work they do, and also support yourselves, owners and undertakers in what we do. So we created a new team, which is the standards and incidents team, and predominantly the main work of the standards team is really to provide advice and guidance to engineers and owners. And so an initial part of the work, what we're doing is we want to look at the reports that they do. So these inspection reports, look at the supervising engineer reports, and try and help them to improve them. I'm sure you'll be aware some of these documents can be very technical. And one of the things we want to try and do is make sure that when these reports are produced, they're produced in a manner that anyone can read them, and that be a technical person or a non-technical person. And again, I'm going to touch on this later on in the very, very last slide. And likewise, you know, we really want to help you deliver your responsibilities under the Act. So again, the team will be starting to look at ways that we can help you. And one of the things we're thinking about at the moment is possibly coming up with some training days or drop-in centres, or like tonight where I come and attend some of your meetings, and we're looking at maybe having like a training day once a year where we ask you what you want to know about, and then we would create a training day, whether it covers one or two subjects or 3 or 4, depending on how big they are. And then we would open that to anyone to join us. We would record it as well, so people can always go back and see it again. And that's the new duties and powers of what we do. We also need some powers as well regarding what we call to serve stop notices. So at the moment, under the Act, if we see something that's not being done right, we have minimal powers to stop that from happening. So again, some of the new duties will be to give us, if we see something that's wrong, then we can stop that, and then we can help and support it, whether it's the engineer or the owner, to put that right. That's that one. Lessons learned. Another one, again, that is really about the incidents and how we share that. And there's two things there. One is we currently produce an annual report where we share lessons learned. But one of the things we want to change is we want to get any lessons learned from that out to you quicker. As I said, because it's an annual report and it's done on a sort of calendar basis, if we produce a report in January and then 2 days after there's an incident, in essence, it's going to be another year before we get an opportunity to share those lessons learned. So one of the things we want to do is think about how we can improve and make it more efficient and easier for you to see them. So if, in my mind, if there's an incident and there's some lessons to be learned and to be shared, my idea would be that we want to share that with you as soon as we can. You know, and whether that's within a day, within an hour, or within a week. And again, we're looking into that. The other thing we want to do as well is just change lessons learned. At the moment, the definition of an incident is where basically where an owner would have to release water or lower the water unplanned. And what I mean by that is if you've got some maintenance that you want to carry out and it's planned and you need to draw the water down to do that, then that wouldn't be an incident. It's just in an emergency if there's a sudden release of water or you have to lower the water down. And one of the areas that gets missed quite a lot is what we call near misses. And we know there's a lot of those happen, and there's some really good practices and some good lessons to learn from some of those near misses. In essence, it's really, we want to share what did the owner do to make it a near miss and not an incident. And it's the what did the owner do that we want to share. So again, we're going to look at changing the definition of incident reporting to include near misses. And I'll probably leave it at that on those subjects. But if anyone wants to come back on any of the others, then I'm more than happy to do that. Next slide, please, Alex. Right, the last two slides really just cover some of the information that you can have access to. As part of this work and part of this project, as we've said, it's going to cover probably the next 2-3 years. So what we've done is we've created this web page, which is really, it's an information page. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's a link there to it. We've put it on what's called Citizens Space. And again, if you log into that, and what you can see there is just the front screen. And what we plan to do is update that regularly with all the work that's going on, you know, the work that we're planning in the future. If there are any pieces of work we want input to, and again, we can put the links on there. So I would urge you to start looking at this page. Like I say, it provides you with a number of options. Next slide, which I think is my last one. Yep, and the last one really is just, like I say, I touched on it earlier, is that if you go onto the Citizens Space page, one of the things you'll see is that we've just rolled out a survey. I know Mark's got the links to the survey, and I think after tonight's meeting, Mark's going to share those links with you. Again, if you share this presentation, right at the bottom, again, there is a link to the survey on that. What the survey is really is we want to do 3 things with this survey. One of the main things we want to do is, as I mentioned before about the new team within reservoir safety, which is standards, there are a number of questions in the survey. I suppose before I go on, the survey, it's online. It will take you between 10 and 20 minutes to answer the questions. And also it'll give you an opportunity right at the end to say, if you want to be more involved with this work, then if you provide your name and phone number, then we will contact you and you can be more involved with some of the work that we do as well. So it's really up to you. You can either just happily, view the website page and learn from there, or you can be active and involved in some of the work that we do as well. It's really up to you how much involvement you want. So like I say, going back to this survey, there are 3 parts to it. The first part of the survey is really to look at standards. Like I mentioned, one of the things we want to do is we want to ask you your thoughts and opinions on the reports that you receive. So under the Reservoirs Act, as we say, you have to have an inspection every 10 years. You have to pay for that. You have to pay for the engineer who produces a report. They can be very technical, these reports. And again, it's really what we want to try and do is some of the questions we're asking is things like, do you find the report helpful? Do you find it useful? Which part of the report do you think is the most important bit to you and why? And also about how we can improve it. If you read it and you don't understand it, then tell us about it. Like I said, one of the things we want to do is look at how we can shape these reports to meet your needs. Because again, I'm conscious as the inspecting engineer's report, as an example, can be anything from 20 pages to 60 pages to 100 pages long. But it may be that there's only 1 or 2 pages that you really need to focus in on. And so it's really that's what we want to know. And then what we can do from your feedback there, we can look at, is there a training need for engineers? Do we need to produce a training program or some form of training where we can train the engineers to be able to either write technical reports that non-technical people can read, or whether it's communicate or talk technical aspects and terms in a non-technical way. That's just one example. And like I said, the other example is changing the format. So again, if there's feedback to say, every time I get a report from my engineer, it's 50 pages long, and really it's page 5. That's the page that I need to see. So if that is the case, why can't we make page 5 the front page for you, so you can see straight away what you need to see, and then there's always that option if you want to look at the detail behind those requirements, you can then read into the report and do it as well. And like I said, so from that survey and from those questions, we want to look at some new training for engineers to improve the reports, and also training that you may need as well as an owner. So again, things like, if you don't fully understand the Reservoirs Act, can we provide you some help and some training or some guidance? Or are there just elements of the Act that you don't understand? I'm also conscious that out of all this work, the Reservoirs Act may change. We may come up with a brand new Reservoirs Act for England. So again, that feedback will help us shape that. It will help us shape the communication strategy that we do to push that in and push that out as well. Another part of the survey is to look at on-site emergency flood plans. And again, we're asking questions about your thoughts on the on-site emergency flood plans. For the people that have had to produce them, we'd like to know how useful were they? How long did they take to produce? Have you used them? And if you have used them, why did you use them, and what did you use them for? And were there any lessons you learned from that as well? The third bit of the survey is to help us with like I say, some of the hazard classification work as well, and looking at how we can improve that as well within that area. So like I said, there's 3 parts. You ideally, if you can answer all of it, that's fine. But if there's just 1 or 2 areas that you're more interested in, then the survey allows you to just complete those bits. And finally, I'll probably just finish on the survey. The end date is the 23rd of February. So we've got nearly a month, nearly 4 weeks to hold with that. And I think that's the end of my presentation and talk, Alex.
Right, well, thank you very much for that, Tony. Very, very useful as always. And I can see we've already had a couple of questions in now, but if anybody does have anything further for Tony or Mark, if you just want to pop it in that Q&A box. Mark, do you want to cover that one from David now, or when we get right to the end?
I can do. So the question was, does this impact or affect tenants? And that comes to, and I'm assuming therefore that your club rents waters on a reservoir or raised lake. That is covered under the definition of an undertaker under the Reservoir Act, which sounds very technical, but what it basically means is that the legal responsibility is on the user of that reservoir or raised lake, as opposed to the actual owner. As a club, you should have that covered within your leases, and I would hope you'd understand responsibilities. So it just depends. But as a tenant, yes, it could be that you are also an undertaker or the undertaker with the legal requirements. The big difference here is, previously, as Tony said, the Reservoir Act, or the high risk element of the designation of the Reservoir Act, covers 25,000 cubic meters and above, whereas ministers have indicated that they wish to have the Reservoir Act applying down to reservoirs of 10,000 cubic meters and above. That's quite a change. That was they have that ability under statutory instruments at the moment under the Reservoir Act, but that was never actually brought in at the last review, which was about 10 years ago. Although Wales did actually bring in that, lowering that threshold to 10,000. So they have had experience of some years on the implications of that. The other thing that the ministers have made clear to government departments is they want it risk-based. So at the moment, it is not. It could be better described, managed in a better risk-based scenario than it presently is. And they've also said that it should be proportionate, and that from day one, they want stakeholders who may be affected by this to be involved in the process, which is why I've been involved from day one. If that doesn't answer your question, happy to take others on that in that area.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. And David, I should add as well, I've got your couple of questions in via email, which I'm happy to follow up separately outside the meeting, just because they might not necessarily fall under the remit of what we're talking about here tonight, but I will definitely follow those ones up for you. Right, so the next one in from tonight is actually from Paul Freer. Evening, Paul, hope you're well, long time no see. Paul says, and this will be one for you, Tony, can you define what is a near miss?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, a near miss could be anything. It could be a simple thing like, you know, you were walking out on site and you saw a leak coming out of a pipe, and when the person went to investigate, they saw that there was debris trapped in the valve, and so all you did was open the valve out wide to flush out the debris that were caught, and then you close the valve again to the level that allowed the water to go. So it's not an incident, but it could have been an incident if that valve was allowed to continue to block and to get worse. What could have happened is it could have fully blocked. You may not have been able to do the valve. Your reservoir fills up, overtops, and then that overtopping creates erosion and then would lead to a failure of the bank. So, and that's in my mind a really good example of lessons to learn and to share. You know, it's one is why we walk in the bank. Was there any particular reason? You know, had it been reported that there was a blockage, and if so, by who? And then again, what actions did you take to alleviate that near miss? And then it's that what we can share with others about it, and it could cover anything. You know, it could cover communications. You know, it could cover things like mobile phones, and coverage is always a good one. You know, where you know, things happen, and like I say, you stop something from happening before it escalates to an incident. I hope that helps with the example of an EMS.
I think so. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, David's just come back as well and said spot on. Thank you, David. Which is actually brings us to, puts us in the very strange position of not having many more questions in. So if anybody does have anything they'd like to ask, please do fire them in now. So I think what we will be doing, obviously, Tony alluded to the survey before, and we're going to look to circulate that as widely as possible. I would say if you've got any contacts of your own that you could pass it on to, that would also be really helpful from our perspective in terms of getting it around. We've also got the recording from the last session that we did with Tony, which I think was nearly 2 years ago now. And just, I mean, from the people that are on the call, I'd be very curious to know, has everybody watched that? Was there anyone that attended that previous meeting that's on the call tonight? I think it'd just be really useful for a bit of background. So if anybody does have anything, please do pop it in the chat.
I think we've had one from Eric Prescott. Eric, I think I saw you type in hi. Was there a specific point you wanted to raise?
I suspect he might still be typing, Mark.
Okay. Perhaps I'll say a couple of things then from my point of view. I mean, been involved in this for quite a long time. The big change, as I said, is government or ministers indicating they want to drop from 25 to 10. That will capture an awful lot more fishing lakes, fishing venues. I think also one piece of work that's been done by the consultants is looking at regimes and safety regimes worldwide, and comparing the dams that we have to dams in Europe or elsewhere. And I think one of the interesting points coming out of that work was, our reservoir stock is actually very old, as opposed to the reservoir stock in, say, Scandinavia or other parts of Europe, which tend to be newer and bigger. So Tony, I think, alluded to with climate change in his comments and the fact that our reservoir stock, and if you look at how those dams were built at that time, and their life, I was going to say life cycle, but their end of life perhaps, there needs to be more focus on that going forward. Particularly, with climate change, the fact that a lot of it are earth bunds built quite a long time ago. And the last thing we want to see is clubs losing their fishing lakes or what have you because of an incident. And hopefully we can engage with you to be able to come up with a sensible solutions to these issues.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Mark said there, like we say, it is an aging stock that we've got in England and in the UK. I think if memory serves me right, I think at the moment the average age in the UK, or certainly in England, is around about 125 years old, is the average age of the dams. The oldest dam is just over 800 years old. Again, an old stock. If you go to Europe, I think the average age is about 50 years, maybe 60 years. But as Mark says, they tend to be a lot bigger and a lot taller. But the principle's still the same, how we use them. And like I say, it's really looking at how we can make sure that stock lasts and continue to last, whether it's through good maintenance, and where you can capture and stop things progressing to the point where you need to spend even more money. So, the role of the supervising engineer is key, and some of the sort of regular maintenance work is key as well. in what you do. The other thing I was just going to say, I don't know if there's any questions yet, but I was just add a little bit to Mark's comment about the word undertaker. I've used it a couple of times, and I refer to the owner. As you say, it's a strange word in one sense, the undertaker, because we all think it means something else. But again, it was created in essence by the lawyers. The lawyers liked certain words. Back in 1975, when this produced, it was done. But what it means is an undertaker means an undertaking. You know, what undertaking is happening on site, and as Mark says, the Reservoirs Act recognises the undertaker, i.e., who's doing something on site, who's operating that site, who's managing the water level of that reservoir, and that may not be the owner. That could be, as we say, a user. Or a lease, you know, someone leasing it for a certain activity. It can also be more than one person. So you may have a reservoir that you may have a fishing club on it, but then again, it may be used for something else as well. So they can be multiple undertakers on a reservoir as well. And again, that creates its challenges as well. Under the Act, like I say, it recognises an undertaker first. If there are then no undertakings happening, then it would revert to the landowner who would be responsible. So if you have a fishing club and it's predominantly just for fishing, and then you decide as a business to stop that, but the reservoir or the lake stays there, then there's still the requirements to look after that asset as well. And as Mark alluded to, the key about the Reservoirs Act is it's about the dam. It's about dam safety. You know, without that dam, you won't have no water and you won't have no business or leisure activity there.
Absolutely.
We've got two Erics now. I can see the point you're trying to make, Eric. I don't know if you've seen that, Tony, but basically Eric's bringing up the issue of cascades, Tony. So he has 3 lakes, 2 small lakes, draining into a larger lake. My understanding is that we've taken cascades off the impacts of cascades off this review. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. What we did do earlier, a few years back, we looked at originally part of the work was to say, should we lower the threshold and should we include cascades as well? And what we mean by cascades is to say at the moment, if say you've got 3 reservoirs and 2 were 10,000 cubic meters and 1 was 6,000 cubic meters, then collectively it's 26, therefore it's over 25 and therefore it would fall under the Act. And then the issue was if you drop that 25 to 10, then it's going to capture even smaller ones as well. Some of the work that we did, we looked at cascades and we looked at the threshold, and one of the conclusions was that you don't need to do both. You can either do one or the other. You can either introduce cascades or lower the threshold. By lowering the threshold from 25 to 10, you would capture most of the cascade reservoirs that would make up a volume greater than 25. So the push and the drive at the moment is purely to look at lowering the threshold. I think personally, it's a case of when, not if, that 10 is going to come in. But then again, I'm not a politician. One thing I didn't say as well regarding this work that we're doing is, I'm sure you're all aware there's going to be a general election this year. That could change things as well. If the government changed colour, then that new government might want to review what we've done. As all government bodies, they want to introduce their own things. So if the colours do change of the government, then it may have a little impact on this because they just may want to look at it and review it and put their thoughts and opinions on it. But again, we've factored those changes in, the possible changes as well. I suspect it may just cause a small delay if it is a new government, because they'll want to have time to review to see whether they want to continue doing what they're doing. But regarding cascades, I don't think, the decision's been made previously that we can just focus on one rather than the other.
So it's when it's talking about 3 lakes now, it would be divided into the 3 lakes as opposed to regarded as one big lake.
Absolutely. No, thanks guys, and should answer your question, Eric. Right, so the next one in is from Andrew Strickland. Evening, Andrew. So Andrew says, will the new ideas include powers for the EA to have a say in planning? More and more water keeps being pushed into reservoirs due to new houses and roads nearby, which, given the climate change, seems madness, given how many of the reservoirs are hundreds of years old.
Yeah, no, that's right. We are. One of the things we're working with at the moment is the local planning authorities and the guidance that the agency produce as well. To that, again, a good example would be, and the reason why we're trying to do it is at the moment, certainly from the reservoir, from the Environment Agency's point of view, we are a planning consultee on any planning application. So if there is planning applications, whether it's near a watercourse or within a reservoir inundation area, then we get an opportunity to comment. As a consultee, the local planning authority have the power to either incorporate our suggestions, or again, they could choose to ignore them as well. We don't have that remit, but a good example really would be the reason why we need to input is maybe I'll give you an example. An example would be you may own a reservoir that sits in a location where downstream there's nothing. So under the current classification, if there's nothing downstream, no impact to life, then the reservoir would be, we would class it as not high risk. Now, if along came the local authority and approved a development just downstream of that reservoir and say suggested to build 100 houses, then once those 100 houses were built, we would then have to re-look at the classification. And if there were 100 houses and they were within the inundation area, then it would be most likely that that reservoir would become a high risk reservoir. And so through no fault of the owner of the reservoir, the Reservoirs Act would then be fully implemented into that. So the owner of that asset would have to appoint a supervising engineer. They would have to appoint an inspecting engineer every 10 years to look at it, and then also to look at the different design criteria as well. So again, to give you an example, once a reservoir gets designated as high risk, when we look at the design elements of a reservoir, that's subdivided into 4 categories of design, what we call A, B, C, and D. So you'll see a reservoir can get labelled, it's a high risk category A or a high risk category B. And what the alphabet categories are, the A, B's, and C's, that's purely about design purposes. So an example, category A is the highest, and that has to be built to withstand what we call the maximum probable flood, which really can be anything greater than a 1 in a 10,000 year event. You then have category B's, which have to withstand up to a 1 in 10,000 year event. Category C's is 1 in 1,000. Category D's is 1 in 500. Now, the differences in those categories, depending on the reservoir type and the size, to design a reservoir to meet the category D standard, you may be talking thousands of pounds. To build a reservoir and design a reservoir to be a C, you might be talking tens of thousands of pounds. B might be hundreds of thousands, and A, you could be in some cases, some of the really big ones, some of the big 20, 30, 40 meter high concrete dam reservoirs, which are mainly sort of water utility companies, you may be talking millions of pounds. So a downstream development can have a big impact on the owner. So in those cases, what we have been trying to do is in certain cases, as part of our consultee, we've been saying you need to put a condition on this development to either make sure that it's built to defend and it protects the houses from a sudden release of water from the reservoir, and therefore the reservoir wouldn't have any impact on life, and so that status wouldn't change. Or, the developer may have to pay a compensation fee to the landowner because of increased cost that landowner would do. And so they're the 2 sort of recommendations that we do put in. Like I said, we're only a consultee, and local planning authorities can and do incorporate what we suggest, but again, on the wider Environment Agency, I'm aware of it sometimes where the local planning authority decide to not include what the Environment Agency says. Doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. I hope that helps.
I'll just add in on that, in that we have campaigned for a long time, as to have other organisations, on the fact that the Environment Agency should have more powers in this respect than they do at the moment. And we always hear in flooding incidents. I've seen in the paper, I think only just recently, about the Environment Agency stating that, well, we did object to that housing development, but you ignored it. We've got Paul Freer, I think, the next, Alex.
Yeah. So next one from Paul. So Paul says our club's concern is if we drop regulations to 10,000 cubic meters, does our 36,000 cubic meter reservoir suddenly become higher risk? Hazard class is key. Hazard class is key, along with pragmatism, i.e., very rural, low risk versus risk to life, as some of the stuff we just touched on there.
Yeah, like you say, it does. If the threshold is reduced, then reservoirs would fall in. One of the things we're trying to do is look at, as Mark alluded to, is improve it. It is a risk-based approach we take. We're trying to improve that, make it more risk-based. So to give you an example, at the moment, a few years back, we did some initial work on the 10,000, the range between 10,000 and 15,000, and that identified in England, we identified potentially there could be around about 1,500 reservoirs, new ones, which would fall under the Act. Now, of those 1,500, we did some initial assessments, and we thought that probably 500 of them would fall as high risk, and the 1,000 would fall as not high risk. Now, the way that the Reservoirs Act works at the moment is it's very simplistic, which in one way is good and then in another way bad, in that because it's simplistic, it means that everything comes in and everything falls under the Act, and then we do all our assessments, and then then it'll be decided whether it's high risk or not. So the problem with the current system is everything's in until it's out. So you're in, we do some investigation, some will stay in and some will fall out. So one of the things we want the new classification to do is we want to create additional filters to stop those, as an example, those 1,000 coming in straight away. So the new system, in my mind, ideally would just capture the ones that need to be captured, and then we can regulate them. So the 500 we'd manage and we'd help the owners, meet their responsibilities, and the 1,000 that would have the volume but nothing else would sit still outside. There'd still be a reservoir under the Act, but that'd be it. They wouldn't have to do anything else. So it is about being more risk-based in how we approach it, and being proportionate, as Mark said, making sure that, even if you're in, again, having more categories would help being proportionate as well.
Sure. So yeah. So there's no major concern for Paul then, with it potentially dropping in future with
if there's nothing downstream. Yeah. At the moment, the criteria is it's really about impact on the Reservoirs Act's about impact on public life. It's public safety. That's what it's predominantly about. And at the moment, the criteria is, if there's one or more lives downstream, then it would become a risk. And again, we're looking at, and at the moment, again, under the Reservoirs Act at the moment, a high-risk reservoir is just one or more lives. So you could have a reservoir that has, if there's only one life downstream, it has to meet the full requirements of the Act. And if you have 10,000 lives at risk downstream, it falls under the Act. So if you're the owner of the reservoir with 1 or 10,000, your legal responsibilities are identical. And again, what we think is that's not proportionate to the risk. So again, part of the classification is to look at, there may be some lives at risk, but actually the owner with the reservoir with 1 life shouldn't be having to meet the same requirements as the reservoir that's got 10,000 lives. So it's about being proportionate. So again, we're trying to change that as well.
For sure. No, thank you, Tony. Right. So next question in from Crawford. So Crawford says, Tony, it would be useful if you could indicate typical annual costs by the EA, supervising engineer and inspecting engineer for reservoir under the Act. Also, please explain that capacity is taken at top water level. If an undertaker wishes to consider lowering the water level such that the capacity will be under 10k, he can do so, but this activity could actually cause failure, so advice should be taken. If the reservoir becomes registered under the Act, there are then detailed procedures to go through, including formal engineer appointment and certification. In both cases, of course, the possible need for planning permission should be considered up front.
Yeah, there was a lot there, so I might have to come back to Alex on
That's all right.
But regarding the price can vary. Like I say, at the moment, there's the different aspects.
Look,
But we may have lost Tony temporarily.
No, am I still there? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, you're back. Sorry, you just dropped out for a second, Tony.
All right, thanks. Yeah, the appointment of engineers working for an undertaker is a commercial contract between the undertaker or the owner of the reservoir and the engineer. So all of these vary the costs. I've seen a number of cases where the sort of like typical price of what we call a supervising engineer's annual report, can cost anything around about £500 or even a little bit less than that. The inspecting engineer's report can cost £1,000 to £2,000. Again, these are just vague prices because again, it depends on the reservoir itself. If you've got a reservoir that's only got it's only an earth embankment reservoir and it's just 2 meters or 3 meters high, the inspection is going to be quite a light inspection when you compare it to one of the big utility companies that's got a 60-meter high concrete arch dam, which carries a lot more water. So it's very hard to say what the pricing is. There are ranges out there, and again, depending on who the engineers are that you appoint as well. We never recommend engineers. All we say is there are engineers on our panels, and if anybody wants to employ an engineer, then you go to gov.uk. If you type in reservoir panel engineer, and it'll come up with 2 lists. So you've got the supervising engineers and the inspecting engineers list. And then from that, all we recommend is and say to keep your costs down, look at the engineers that live local, because again, there's the travel costs, etc., which could do that. And likewise, again, things that affect prices again is it one reservoir or is it 3 together that they're doing? So again, per reservoir, the price may go down if there's 2 or 3. So if an engineer comes out on site and does some work for an owner and manages to inspect 3 reservoirs, I would assume, the average cost should be a little bit less than just coming out for 1. Pro rata, that is.
For sure, and that's quite an interesting point about the capacity being taken at the top water level as well. So I guess that what Crawford's saying here is that there might be some people who think, oh, we'll just drop the level so it doesn't fall under the Act, but that can actually cause failure as well.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah,
interesting point.
Yeah, if you're ever reducing water in an emergency, then there is we do have guidance out there on the rate of reduction, because again, what can happen is if it's an earth embankment, there will be water within the embankment as well. The earth embankment will be wet, and if you draw it down too fast, you can get pressure that can cause the embankment to slip and move, because it like a suction or a push that can do that as well. But again, there are different ways to do it. So if someone has got a reservoir and say, as an example, it's 11,000 cubic meters, and they say, I don't want it to fall under that. I want to reduce it to 9,000, so it falls out, as an example. Then again, there are ways to do it. Just reducing the water in the reservoir wouldn't solve it. You would have to do physical alterations so that, as Drummond says, the top water level would have to be reduced. So if it's got a spillway or an outlet pipe, you would have to physically do some physical alterations so that the reservoir could never You know, if it filled up in a storm, if all you did was drop your water and then you had a thunderstorm, it would fill back up again. So it's about design purpose and capabilities as well. But there are ways to mitigate falling under the act by reducing things. But again, there's lots of factors in that, you know, again, if you drop the water level, how will that affect fish stocks as well, you know, with water depths and things like that as well. So there's lots of things to consider if you want to do that. But there are opportunities. What I would say is that if you do want to that, I would always seek advice from a panel engineer, because the last thing you want to do is spend money and then find out after spending that money, it hasn't stopped you from falling under the Act. Whereas if you get the engineer involved, they'll be able to provide expert advice to make sure that you know you don't fall under the Act if that's what you want to do.
And just add on that, Tony, that I picked up there has been discussions under the risk assessment discussions about taking into account dam height wall.
Yes,
with regard to risk of loss of life as well. In other words, if you've got 25,000 cubic meters sitting behind a dam wall that is 4 foot high, should that be at the same risk as 25,000 cubic meters sitting behind a 25-foot wall? So those kind of discussions, I think, are ongoing.
Yeah, no, that's right. So to me, a good example would be and again, this is just my opinion. Everyone on this call may have a different opinion as well. But again, I think my personal view is I think height is a good example of a filter. And what I mean by filter is going to that question, how do we stop things getting captured? So at the moment, the filter really is, there's just one question at the moment. The question is, does the reservoir hold more than 25,000 cubic meters? If the answer is yes, it falls under the Act. Whereas you could put an extra filter in. So you ask the first question, does the reservoir hold more than 25,000 cubic meters? Yes. Is the height less than, I don't know, 2 meters, 3 meters, whichever? And if the answer is yes, it stops there. It doesn't fall in, you know, and I see height as a good filter factor is probably the best way of describing it. Some people may see height as an opportunity to use within the classification elements as well. And then there may be other exemptions as well that we can look at from a filter point of view, as in the type of reservoir, what it's used for, its construction type as well. But you're right, Mark, in that, you know, if you've got a reservoir that's only a metre high or 3 foot high and it fails, you know, it may mean that a lot of people get their feet wet and some of the houses and things will get wet. But the inundation is very different if you've got a 20, 25, 26 high metre dam that fails. You know, you would be talking property destruction at those heights if that water went. So again, it's about proportionality.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Tony. Right, well, that brings us to the end of the Q&As that we've had in so far tonight. So I think we'll probably draw things to a close unless anybody's got anything else burning. But before we do, Tony and Mark, any sort of final thoughts from you guys?
I mean, one for me is please get involved with the work that we're doing. You know, we want your input, we want your insight, we want your knowledge. You know, you're in a good position to help us shape the future. One of the things I do try and say is, if you look at the Reservoirs Act at the moment, the current one, it was produced back in 1975. You know, so it's been around nearly 50 years. So to me, we're on a journey now over the next few years where we are going to shape the future for the next 50 years at least, I would say, if not longer. So maybe for me, who's someone who's getting towards the end of their career, what a legacy to leave behind for the industry, you know, for the next 50 years. If there's any younger ones out there who are just starting their career, you know, they're just starting a fishing club or starting a business, what a great opportunity you've got to influence and shape your future. So don't pass it up, you know, please get involved, you know, have a look at the survey, you know, come and talk to us. You know, if you want to be involved in it, like I said, the survey does allow you to put your name and number and come and join us on this journey. You know, it's quite exciting.
Well said.
Yeah, I'd agree that, having been through this for some time, Tony, and the changes. The way I think the way ministers have provided the guidance of the way forward is far more imaginative and helpful, perhaps, than we have seen previously, which is helpful. I think this video will be available after the presentation. For those that weren't able to come to the first one that we gave, that will also be available together with the survey.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, as Mark says, we'll look to circulate that as soon as possible to everybody. I can see there's no sort of further questions in, so we will leave it there. Obviously, if there is anything that you didn't get a chance to ask tonight that comes to you, by all means, forward it to us, and we'll look into that for you. But yeah, firstly, huge thanks to obviously Tony and Mark for coming along tonight. You know, really appreciated that you can be here to share some of your knowledge and you know, get some thoughts and feedback from people. So thank you ever so much for that, and thank you ever so much to everybody that's come along to the event tonight as well. I appreciate a lot of people would probably rather be in the pub than talking about reservoir safety, but it's something that is really important. So your time here is greatly appreciated by all of us this evening, and thank you to Mark as well, who's been writing up the notes in the background. Yeah, so yeah, thanks Eric and thanks Paul. Who I've just seen there. So yeah, we will be in contact with you soon, and signing off for now. All the best.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.